Performance time, come on and run some tests. We're going to find a memory leak. I've got no friends but virtual users. Soak test never end, it's performance time.
Hi there and welcome to Performance Time, the show where we look at the basics of performance testing with fresh eyes. Today, what is parameterization? Bit of a mouthful, but at the end of the day, parameterization, when we say that, we're talking about data pools. So that's nice, keep it nice and simple, but I'm going to have to use the word parameterization because that's the word everyone uses. So let's push on and see what we learn. So when we do load testing, we test a system of some kind, the system under test. And in order to do that, we've talked about in previous episodes the concept of a network conversation that we simulate in order to put the system under load. In order to have that conversation, sometimes we have to provide some kind of data. So as a simple example, a username and a password. Now we don't want to have 500 virtual users all submitting the same username and password. That's not realistic, and that might have implications on performance. So we need to get unique username and passwords for each of those users somehow, and we do that by using a data pool. So that's what parameterization is. It is the method, it is the process of taking some test data from a repository of some kind and dynamically injecting it into the requests that we send to the system under test. That's parameterization. So, what do we need to know about it? So here's some examples from my career, keeping in mind that I work for an insurance company, so a lot of these are insurance specific. So obviously username and password, personal information such as a name and date of birth, maybe addresses and phone numbers, security tokens. In some cases I need maybe to call an API, I need a particular security token to do that. Addresses and locations. In the insurance world, we have a lot of claim numbers, policy numbers, and customer numbers that we need to generate, to use during our load testing. Vehicle information and bank accounts are other examples. Now, I put a little asterisk next to two of these just to point out that some test data is sensitive in nature from a security perspective. So it's important that we manage that test data effectively. So we wouldn't want to be taking a production security token and using it in an inappropriate way, or taking it outside of the organization in an insecure network. So we just be a little bit aware of the test data and whether it's important that you need to keep it secure or not. Just to think about that. So where is our test data? It depends on our load testing tool that we're using. In most cases, mostly load testing tools store or retrieve test data either from a flat file, a text file, such as a CSV or a spreadsheet, or a database. And maybe it's a common database like MySQL or SQL Server. Maybe it's a bespoke database that comes with the load testing tool. And there is another option where you may call an API during your test to dynamically retrieve test data or get it generated for you. I don't know. I guess you could say that's test data as a service. It's another way of doing things. I haven't used that often, only to generate security tokens. I think that's the only time that I've used that approach, but it's a good one if you can get it working. So when we're reading test data during our test, there are different ways that we can do that. We can read it from top to bottom sequentially, which is a very common way to go about things. We can read it from bottom to top, was another example. We could randomly select a record from our data pool, a set of test data. And we also get to decide when we get to the end of our data, do we want to go back up to the top and read the data again or not, if we're reading it sequentially. So there are some different things we can think about and what the performance impact might be and what's more realistic and what's not. Sometimes we want to call exactly the same test data every test so we can compare over multiple tests and see how that goes. Other times we don't care. It might be better to randomize that to get a more chaotic outcome. And that brings us on to consumable test data. Sometimes there is test data that we use, and once it's used, it can't be used again. It needs to be consumed. So in my world, that would be a quote, an insurance quote would be a good example. You might have a load test which takes a quote number. It uses that to then purchase an insurance policy. Now, once the policy's been created, that quote can't be used anymore. It's already been turned into a policy, or it's been archived, or whatever it is. So in some situations, we need to consume test data as we go through it. So that's one of the important features that many load testing tools don't provide, but they should. The other thing to think about is the scope of your data pools. What if you are running a test and you have two load generators? And in many situations, the default is that they will have their own copy of the test data. And sometimes that doesn't work. Sometimes you don't necessarily want for example, you don't want two instances of the same user account being used at the same time. You want every user to have their own copy. And there are ways of splitting the test data across them, but the simplest way is to have a centralized data pool. Source which you can then pull the test data out of across both load generators. That's often a much better way to go about things. So that's just a little bit about parameterization and data pools and load testing. I've moved very quickly over a lot of basic concepts, and I will endeavor to go into much more detail in the future about parameterization and data pools and test data and load testing. But I think this is a pretty good start. And next time we'll be looking at correlation. So I'll see you next time.